it seems, of near-death experiences. So what near-death experiences provide, and Kelly has really hit the nail on the head, is evidence of a type of mental functioning which is independent of the activity of the nervous system. And this becomes particularly clear in one subset of near-death experiences. Near-death experiences during cardiac arrest. Near-death experiences during cardiac arrest are at odds with the materialist paradigm. So the pioneer in the field is the Dutch cardiologist Pim van Norman, I talked about yesterday, who published an article in his research in The Lancet the year of his retirement. And at present, Sam Varnia, who is cooperating with the AWARE project, studying near-death experiences in multiplicity of hospitals, should be releasing his data shortly. We've been expecting it for some time now. Sam Varnia is one of the leading researchers in a very new medical field, the field of resuscitation. So we can hope, simply because of the advance in medical technology, to have more and more cases of near-death experiences in the future. To understand why near-death experiences during cardiac arrest pose a major problem for the materialist paradigm, one has to get a sense of what happens during cardiac arrest. During cardiac arrest, the heart simply stops, blood flow stops, and the oxygen uptake in the brain collapses. EEGs, in other words, the electrical activity of the brain, goes flat within 10 to 20 seconds. Then you have rapidly the three major signs of death. No cardiac output, no breathing, and no brainstem reflexes. When you have reported mental activity in these states, you are dealing with something which is totally at odds with the materialist paradigm. And Pim van Norman is a cardiologist, he retired after some 15 years experience, reported within 300 cardiac arrest cases, interviewed within 2 days of resuscitation, there were 41 near-death experiences. So if you're a materialist, this has to be explained. Because this is, if it occurs during the cardiac arrest, this is physiologically impossible. There's no electrical activity of the brain, there's no oxygen input. So somehow, this has to be accounted for. And for this reason, even though these near-death experiences are non-veridical, right? The patient does not experience something which can be verified by others, just such non-veridical near-death experiences during cardiac arrest are a major problem for the materialist account of the brain. If they occur during cardiac arrest, and there is no electrical activity, they refute the materialist account of the brain period. Then this has obviously led philosophers and psychologists of a materialist bent to try to counter this. And Susan Blackmore is one of those interesting cases of someone who lost the true faith, as it were. She believed that near-death experiences demonstrated the non-material nature of the mind, and then she changed her opinion. And it's a well-known fact that when you change religions, you are more hostile to your former religion than anyone who never was of that religion in the first place. But that's her case. And she has been very helpful to us in providing mechanism after mechanism. So the tunnel of light, which as I mentioned is actually not characteristic of most near-death experiences, is explained, according to Blackmore, by the shutdown of retinal neurons. Out-of-the-body experiences are explained by the reconstruction of a non-physically based self, in bliss by the release of endorphins. The basic problem with Blackmore's explanations is that for the two first ones, there's no physiological evidence that this is happening. I mean, yes, indeed, the brain does shut down. Whether the shutdown of the retinal neurons would induce an experience of a tunnel of light, nobody has a clue. That's what she says. And out-of-the-body experiences, as a result of the reconstruction of a non-physically based self, the deconstruction of the physically based self is something which is yet to be understood. It's a hypothesis. And obviously this account of OBs, out of the body experiences, collapses if someone has paranormal experiences during an OB. Because then the most plausible explanation is simply that something left the body. But it is worth looking at these accounts. Her final account is more convincing. It's well known that endorphins are released during stressful episodes. This could account for the experience of bliss. It's perfectly possible. I think our pussycat wants to contribute something to the debate. Veridical NDEs are much more problematical, and Pim van Lommel had a collection of these. Veridical NDEs are near-death experiences where the subject has access to information he could not have access to, and this information is independently verified. And Pim van Lommel mentions a case of a veridical NDE under cardiac arrest. So here, this is a very strong case. It's occurring under cardiac arrest in a hospital. The patient, a Dutch gentleman, had a heart attack. He's brought in cyanotic. In other words, basically his complexion has veered to the dark blue, grey-dark blue color due to lack of oxygen, in a coma. And the nurse who was intubating him sees that he has dentures, so she removes his dentures before intubating him, putting him in an artificial lung. Then they struggle to maintain the patient alive, and actually the medical staff was half of the opinion that perhaps they should give up. It wasn't quite clear with the patient's past history they had access to that he had any chance of survival. They continue, and a week later, the poor patient had lost his dentures. And when the nurse who intubated him came in the ward, he mentions to her, "Oh, that nurse knows where my dentures are." And then he explains to her, "You took my dentures out of my mouth and put them on there." Now, he was cyanotic. According to the personnel in the emergency room, he was in a coma. There's basically little or no brain activity worth talking of. Yet, he knows the dentures were removed, and not only that, he knows where they were put. This is quite problematical for materialistic kind of consciousness. The period in the man had seen himself lying in bed from above, so this is a clear out-of-the-body experience, and that the nurses and doctors were giving CPR. He described in detail the room. This is not compatible with an account of the brain as a machine which needs oxygen to function on a large scale. And he described the appearance of all present, and he was aware that they were hesitant about continuing the CPR and hoped they would continue. Now, this case is not, how shall we say, it's not fail-proof. It's a strong case. It happens in a clinical milieu. It happens with personnel who has no particular bias. If anything, personnel who is particularly sympathetic to this opinion. These are people who have something to lose if their credibility is put in question. Pim van Lommel had a lot to lose. This is why he published in his accounts the year of his retirement. And yet they feel and they encounter this, especially nowadays, on a regular basis, and they have to talk about it. And I would encourage you to go on YouTube and watch Pim van Lommel's interviews. He's, by all accounts, a very nice person, highly articulate, very thoughtful. And if you watch his account of the history of resuscitation, you will understand why this is a recent phenomenon. The scale of NDEs. Van Lommel points out that really before the 1960s, when he started working as a young cardiologist, it was not possible to resuscitate someone who had cardiac arrest. The equipment which enabled such resuscitation was developed in the late 1950s, was extremely expensive. And really, let's say my father's generation, when my father did his medical internship, when someone had cardiac arrest, the only way to resuscitate them was actually direct cardiac massage, which was normally not possible. Direct cardiac massage involves basically intrathoracic massage of the heart. normal circumstances, unless you're in a hospital as an operating room, this doesn't happen. Otherwise, generally speaking, such patients do not survive. And therefore, these accounts of near-death experiences during cardiac arrest are quite recent. But in the case of veridical near-death experiences, these are a very strong counter to the materialist account of consciousness. They can manifest clear sight, telepathy, remote hearing, clairaudience. And in addition, they suggest clearly that the mind is not a byproduct of the brain. And not only this, that the mind is non-destructive and non-material. It can travel through walls, through space. Then we have to hope that Sampana's AWARE project and the increasing number of such cases we will have will contribute to the progressive disappearance of the materialist account of mind. These cases are particularly strong because they tend to occur in a controlled environment, in a clinical environment, at times in operating theaters. And as I mentioned, they occur in the presence of personnel who is not sympathetic and who is not searching for near-death experiences. If anything, these experiences are something of an embarrassment. The following category of occurrences, which really is strongly at odds with the materialist account of the mind, are the spontaneous memories of previous lives, cases of the reincarnation. Now, these have been studied for more than a century. The earliest studies I know of go back in France to Charles Manson, and the SPR in the UK engaged in studies even in the late 19th century, to my knowledge. But Stevenson, at the University of Virginia, is the first to have studied them systematically. And his position as just, of course, a professor of psychiatry, and I think dean actually, of the faculty at the University of Virginia, gave him tremendous credibility. These studies are ongoing at the University of Virginia. Jim Tucker continues them. Unfortunately, there is a sore lack of funding, and it at present has been very difficult to input all of Stevenson's data in a database for more systematic analysis. The funding just isn't there. As a result, the data analysis I will present to you is partial. Stevenson studied in excess of 2,500 cases, but it's groups of cases which have been analyzed, groups of 800, 900 cases. So memories of past lives can be subdivided into two broad groups: spontaneous memories and memories elicited through hypnotic regression. There's a third group I didn't mention, which is memories of past lives due to disease or stress. It does happen, it is quite rare. I will focus on spontaneous cases because they are the most interesting for our purpose. There is no particular intent in bringing them out. One does not have to deal with the issues of hypnotic suggestion, even involuntary suggestion by the hypnotist, or cases where the hypnotist might have a bit of an axe to grind, might wish to demonstrate the existence of past lives. This has always been a critique against hypnotic regression. Now, spontaneous cases occur both in adults and in children. They're not restricted to children, but the cases with children are particularly strong because in verified CRTs, one doesn't see how the child could have access to this information. So initially, I'd like to give you a sense of who Ian Stevenson was, because this after all is a component of the credibility of his research. Stevenson is Canadian. He was appointed at a surprisingly young age as chair of the Department of Psychiatry at UVA, which has one of the best medical schools in the United States. When I was there, it was the second or third medical school in the country. From early on, I suppose you could say he was a bit of an iconoclast. He published articles challenging the Freudian viewpoint. Then one of his colleagues, who had a sharp tongue, asked him whether he still dared to walk the streets unarmed after this. You can see how the Freudian dogma was dominant in the 1950s. But Stevenson, in 1966, published a book, which was the first book I ever bought when I arrived at the University of Virginia. I didn't know of its existence. I went to UVA's bookstore, and here I saw, and this was in 1986, 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation, published by UVA University Press. And I said, my goodness, I didn't even know this was happening. This was before the internet, right? We just didn't know about these things. And I, at the period, was a novice monk studying under Jeffrey Hawkins. I was absolutely floored by the quality of Stevenson's research. Because I had read books on people purporting to remember past lives, and I always felt it was a bit dodgy. I mean, everyone seemed to remember being Cleopatra and Napoleon. Nobody remembered being a peasant toiling away in the mud. No memories of animal lives. Then, it begs the question, right? I mean, back when I was Napoleon, many things I wished I had done. But with Stevenson's work, he was a psychiatrist, an academic, former head of the Department of Psychiatry, who was investigating these cases in a scientific fashion, and who was obtaining results which are very convincing, all the more so because they were sometimes slightly at odds with the Buddhist teachings, which is what you would expect, right? I mean, whenever, I don't know if you've ever heard of data from crime scenes, right? When you're looking at data from crime scenes in forensics, whenever everything meshes perfectly, you're entitled to assume something is wrong. Because real life doesn't function like that. Real life tends to be a bit messy. You expect a certain amount of contradictions and incompatibilities. So with Stevenson's data, you could really see, if you looked at the data in 20 cases, that this looked like real life data. It was a bit messy, but strong. Then Stevenson, 2 years after the publication of this book, faced new dismissal from the University of Virginia, precisely because of the tenor of his research. The topic was too loaded. He was kept on. He was able to remain full professor at the University of Virginia until the end, largely because of the support of an important American industrialist, Chester Carlson. And he published 2 sets of works after this. We have most of his works in the library here. I cannot encourage you too highly to study Stevenson's works. If you want to ground your Buddhist practice in something solid, and not just to have a faith-based practice which is fragile, you must work through part of Stevenson's works. I could read them out, but they're quite heavy, you'll forgive me. The following set of publications was Cases of the Reincarnation Type. It's a series of cases divided by geographical area, Sri Lanka, Turkey, and so forth. And his magnum opus was Reincarnation and Biology, 2 gigantic volumes of around 2,000 pages each, studying the impact these memories of previous rebirths have on the bodies of the children who have them. It's an extraordinary piece of work. You really owe it to yourselves to read it. I mentioned to one of you who is sincerely interested in Buddhism, that if you are sincerely interested in Buddhism, I would put Lamrim aside. But Lamrim starts too high for us. And I will take 1 year and just study Stevenson's data. Work through 20 cases of reincarnation, just a smallish book. Then pass up to cases of reincarnation type. And then work quietly your way through reincarnation in biology. And then return to the Lamrim. You will look at the Lamrim with very different eyes. So peer assessment in this field is important, since we're not really able, otherwise, to assess the quality of the research. As I mentioned yesterday, Doris Kuhlmann-Wilsdorf, who has passed on, professor of engineering, actually, in the Department of Physics, Material Science. And one of Stevenson's long-term colleagues mentioned that the statistical probability that reincarnation does in fact occur, at least occasionally, is so overwhelming, established by thousands of already documented cases of remembered lives, and strongly buttressed by the incidence of birthmarks, in conjunction with many of Stevenson's well-documented cases, that cumulatively the supporting evidence is not inferior to that for most, if not all, branches of science, whether physics, cosmology, or Darwinian evolution. Then she mentioned this after her retirement. And Leslie King, who's book review editor for the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is the official journal of medical in America. It doesn't get really more square than this in the United States. Points out that Stevenson's data is difficult to explain under the breath. So, if at the end of this 2-day symposium, you leave TBI with the resolve to read Stevenson's works, and ideally also to read Kelly's Irreducible Mind, on time and investment, you will then be able, on that basis, to continue your own investigation by yourself. I would like at present to enter in an analysis of cases of reincarnation. This is one of the cases that we've been talking about, a young Turkish boy. And forgive if any one of you is of Turkish origin, forgive my pronunciation. Sevgili Tutuşmuş. So if we look at the breakdown of Stevenson's cases, and this does not include Jim Tucker's cases, which would add, I'd say, a couple hundred, maybe of American cases to this end. Stevenson analyzed and investigated a total of 2,500 cases. Keep in mind, this is 2,500 interviews of children and their families all over the world, over some 50 years. It's a gigantic amount of work by one man in a small team. Of these, 1,600 cases were unverified. In other words, the child had memories. It was impossible to see whether the memories were true or not. It doesn't mean the memories are false. There's just no verification. 895 cases were verified. And this is almost 900 children who had clear memories of past lives. Stevenson investigated the case, drew up a list of the memories, the typically recognition of family members, the names of the family members, items which were hidden and lost, which the child finds, changes in the house before the childbirth, the child remembers. There are 895 such cases. And of these cases, there are 65 cases with autopsies of the body of the previous connected person. Autopsies indicated the cause of death, which enabled Stevenson to publish Reincarnation Biology, in which he draws a correlation between the cause of death in the previous life and birthmarks or deformations in the present life. It's quite extraordinary, you've got to recognize. You find 65 cases of children who reconnect past lives. These memories are verified. To find the previous personality, to find the autopsy in third world countries, get a copy of the autopsy, and then correlate this. And of these, there are 35 so-called best cases. These are cases for which Stevenson considered reincarnation as the only explanation. So in these cases, there are alternate explanations which have to be excluded. The first, obviously, is fraud from the investigator of the family. Then Stevenson really was above reproach in this matter and had a tremendous amount to lose. It was far from clear that he ever gained anything from his research. Whatever reputation he had was basically put in question by his research. The families have, in most cases, very little to gain. They don't want the child to talk about a previous life. In many of the cases Stevenson studied, most of the cases actually, the death is violent, it is connected to accidents or crimes, it is is not something the families want to talk about. Self-deception is a big risk for the investigator and the family. But again, the data is very strong, as you will see. Alternate sources of information like cryptonesia, where you learn something and forget you knew it, is also a big risk. Again, in many of these cases in third world countries, it's almost impossible to see how the child had access to the information, and there was no financial advantage. Paranormal phenomena to be excluded is much more complex. It's very difficult to know whether these are memories of past lives, or cases of telepathy where the child reads another person's memories, clairvoyance of possession. The key feature which enables us to separate these two is a strong sense of I of the child. The child says it was me. He doesn't say, oh, so-and-so dropped a red letter on the street and it was taken up and hidden in this box. The child says, I saw. The child, in other words, identifies with the events. This is absent in cases of telepathy and in cases of paradox. So what are the universal features of the case? The memories manifest the moment the child speaks. The child speaks if he starts speaking of his past life. The memories are no longer spoken about around ages 5 or 7. This is not always the case. Some of the cases, Stevenson's cases, keep their memories into adulthood. There's a very high incidence of violent death. Not all the data has been processed, but we're looking at around 70% of the previous lives having had violent deaths. And the mode of death is frequently mentioned. These are universal features in every case. Then there are occasional features that sometimes are present, sometimes are not. There can be physical resemblance to the previous life of body, and face is quite striking sometimes. And birthmarks connected with the cause of death. A similar temperament is quite widespread. So is déjà vu, the feeling that one has experienced something before without quite knowing why. Memories from past lives and vivid recurring dreams are very common. In terms of behavior, one has frequently unexplainable phobias, which tend to be associated to the mode of death in the previous life. Behaving as if still an adult, what I think New Age inclined people call being old souls. Unusual play is quite common. And this is not something which really concerns Westerners, but unexplainable dietary preferences. In many Asian countries, for instance, one's diet is very, very constrained by one's culture. If you're, for instance, let's say if you live in Burma, you eat spicy cooked fish. Then there's a bevy of Stevenson's cases of children remembering being Japanese soldiers killed in Burma, born with deformations due to the torture inflicted to them by the Burmese partisans before they died, who systematically don't want to eat cooked fish, but want to eat raw fish, which nobody eats in Burma, and which have character traits which are very akin to those attributed to Japanese soldiers. Harshness, a sort of cruelty, hardness, and which are very much at odds with the Burmese temperament. Now, as I mentioned, we don't have a breakdown of all of Stevenson's cases. Hopefully this will arise in the future, so I have to rely on a partial breakdown. Breakdown by gender, a large proportion of the children remembering past lives are male. I think for two reasons. First, because males attract more attention in most countries of the world, male children of the present day. And also because in cases of the reincarnation type, there is, generally speaking, little gender crossover. It happens, but it's rare. And most of the children who have memories of past lives remember a violent death. Violent deaths are more common among males, much more in all cultures. Then, if we look at the mode of death, in the solved cases, this is a subset, unfortunately, 50% of the deaths are violent. In the unsolved cases, it's 90% of the deaths. An empirical figure which has been relied upon by Stevenson's team is between 70 and 80% of all recollected deaths in previous lives are violent. And by violent, we mean not necessarily involving crime, but a sudden termination of the life, which from a Buddhist standpoint has a very specific meaning. This is death through being hit by a car, through falling in a river, through being murdered, but it is not death from cancer or a long, drawn-out disease. Interestingly enough, and this is my personal analysis, almost all the cases of CORTs indicate that the children experience what amounts to post-traumatic stress disorder in relation to the memories of their past life. It's quite striking. There is often no event in their present life to justify such manifestation. Now, what are the features of post-traumatic stress disorder? Distressing thoughts or images, nightmares about traumatic events, and intense psychological distress when exposed to something that triggers memories of the traumatic event. And this occurs with trauma in this life. If someone has been in war, let's say, and has seen one of his comrades shot in a particularly savage fashion, or killed by the roadside, then it is well known that anything related to that can trigger powerful trauma. We see this sort of behavior in children who have past life memories without anything in this life to explain it. For instance, a child who died by drowning, who recollects dying by drowning, will run away screaming from puddles of water. A child who was murdered with a hammer. One of the cases Stevenson's research. It's an adult who was murdered by a hammer. The child who recollects this is unable to stand hammers. Another child who was driven to a hospital in an ambulance after being hit by a car cannot stand to be driven around in a car. So there are specific phobias which are associated with the recollected mode of death. And in the case of 47 children recollecting death by drowning, 64% had a phobia of immersion. Now, what I don't do for TBI, I managed to check phobias of water in Iceland in the Acta Psychiatrica Scandinavica, as I said, what I don't do for you. This is how I like to spend my weekends. Phobias of drowning among Icelandic fishermen. This is a population in which you'd expect a large phobia of water. You've got people who are on the sea all the time, who've known people who've drowned. You'd expect us to have phobias of water. A very small percentage of the population, it's 2%, has a phobia of water. As opposed to 60% among the children who recollect death by drowning. So if you consider this is representative of a population where there'd actually be a pretty good ground for phobia by of water, you can imagine that, say, in Australia, you'd have even less than 1.8% xenophobic. And I'd like at present to study with you one case, the case of Semih Tutush, which is a very interesting case. First, because the child is Turkish, so he does not come from a society in which the belief in reincarnation is widespread. And because it really encapsulates all the key features of Stevenson's cases: clear memories of past lives, recognition of family members, temperament in keeping with the recollected temperament, not just birthmarks, but deformations associated with the mode of death. And if we start analyzing the case, the main features are the following. Semih Tutush is a young boy, was a young boy, born in 1958. But at a very young age, 3, he could barely walk. Left his family home to walk to a neighboring village with which he had no connection after a while. He was profoundly attached to a woman, Katibe, totally unrelated to his family, who was the widow of someone who was murdered. And he had a deep hatred for someone he had never met, a certain Isa Dirbeli, who had been accused of murder. As a child, from the age of 8 to 18, he spent most of his spare time planning to murder Ilia Durovic. He suffered from birth deformations, specifically microtia of the right ear. The right ear was under the front as opposed to the left ear, and what's known as facial hemiplegia, in other words, asymmetry of the face. You can see it's quite striking. One side of the face is underdeveloped. The right side of the face is underdeveloped when compared with the left side of the face. He had clear recollections of a previous life as a certain Selim Fesri, who lived in the village he had walked to as an infant, who was married to Katibi, and who was shot by Ilia Durovic during a hunting expedition in the right ear. He was shot with a shotgun, it seems point blank, in the right ear. He survived several hours, it's actually almost a day. He was taken to the hospital. Shotgun pellets were embedded in the cranium, in the brain, in the right ear, with, as you can imagine, massive damage to the right side of the skull. And Stevenson was able, and this is why this case is very interesting, it's one of the 65 cases where Stevenson found the post-mortem. So this is the post-mortem of the recollected personality in the right area of the skull, the right frontal area. There were 6 round holes made by buckshot. The shot had entered the brain after penetrating the skull. Now, if we look at the deformations of Selim Fesri and see how widespread they are, could this just be a fluke, in other words? We can see that they are quite rare when put all together. Microtia of the right ear occurs in between 1 to 20,000 and 1 to 30,000 births. The fistulas, in other words, the holes, little semi-tutushmush had in his right ear, occur in less than 1% of Caucasian children. Sorry for the white, it should be Caucasian. And hemifacial hyperplasia occurs in 1 to 3,000 to 1 to 5,000 births. Altogether, this would be quite rare. Now, obviously, these are not independent events. You cannot just basically multiply the probabilities as you would if they were independent. But they could be considered to be largely independent. So you're looking at perhaps something occurring in less than 1 in 100,000 cases. Something of that nature. And you can clearly see here the microtia of the right ear, because the left ear is normal. Clear instance of hemifacial hyperplasia. And Stevenson drew the depressions on little semi-tutushmush's ear. Stevenson took his notes in French as a Canadian. So we see facet, small holes which do not lead inside, right ear, and these notes were taken in 1967. Then, the case is quite puzzling. And it has all of the key features of one of Stevenson's cases. You have a child who has clear memories of being murdered. As an infant, he walks alone in the village where he used to live. He was obsessed with his widow, would not allow her to remarry, which is obviously quite a forward concern. And even more so, was obsessed with taking revenge on the man who had murdered him. He said his body was actually sentenced to a jail term. Murder was never conclusively proved. He claimed it was a hunting accident. It seems very short range for a hunting accident. And at the moment Semi-Tutushmush could walk, his main hobby seems to have been to take rocks and throw them at Ilia Durovic's stand at which he sold bottles of homebrew liquor, alcohol. Then Ilia Durovic obviously lived in fear that when the young boy became adult, he would try to take revenge. And Semi-Tutushmush's outlook seems to have improved over time. Stevenson intimates that he became less vindictive over the years. So basically, how is such a case of a reincarnation type compatible with the neurobiological understanding of memory? If memory is physiological, is somehow coded in groups of neurons or individual neurons, how is it possible in Stevenson's 895 verified cases that memories pass from life to life? And all of the memories which are recognized, let's say, in neurology are present. Conditioning memory, procedural memory, memories which are autobiographical, semantic memory. So while it's clear that memory has a physiological basis, it seems just as clear from Stevenson's research that there is much more to it than that. And my personal feeling is that the explanation His Holiness the Dalai Lama has proposed is very sound, which is, and it's what I would drive at the end of this conference, that more the coarse levels of mind are intimately dependent on the brain and on the neural substrate. Subtle levels of mind are not. And this is what we see in near-death experiences, where subtle minds manifest with features which are different from main minds. We have some of our students who have had near-death experiences. They have direct experience of this. I had a near-death experience. I had direct experience of this. The mind, at that point, is much faster, much more powerful, much clearer. It is not the ordinary, coarse, slugging mind we deal with on a daily basis. Then it would be this subtle mind which transmigrates if reincarnation occurs. The precise relationship between the coarse mind and the subtle mind, that is something else. That calls for much investigation. And then we have come to the point where I feel I can tread where perhaps I shouldn't tread, which is the issue of modern psychiatry and possession. Now, before I go any further, I should make it very clear that I'm in no way implying that all mental disease is due to possession. Mental disease has a physiological basis, which psychiatry has done much to elucidate. There are huge swathes of mental disease, like depression, which are pretty well understood. But there are certain categories of mental disease where I think that their classification as physiological ailments is probably due to bias. And those are the ones I would like to talk to you about. You might find it interesting if you have some spare time to study the history of psychiatry. The history of psychiatry is quite fascinating because one realizes that the founders of modern psychiatry, and that is mainly Charcot, a great French psychiatrist who was a bit of an idol of my father, Pierre Janet, his colleague, and Sigmund Freud, their disciple. The founders of psychiatry had not a hidden but an overt agenda, accounting for what was considered really up to the beginning of the 19th century as cases of possession. So up to the end of the 18th century, psychiatric ailments were considered to be due to an exterior entity, a spirit, entering the person and causing distress. This was just mainstream knowledge. It's worth pointing out that nowadays, out of a population of 7 billion, I'd say probably some 4 to 5 billion people out of the West still pretty much subscribe to this view. If you live in India, if you travel to Thailand or much of Asia, this is a mainstream view. People pay lip service to psychiatry, but spirits are a daily reality. They are seen, they are perceived, they can enter unprotected persons or tries to ward oneself against this. Then, in the early 19th century, as materialism took hold, it became critically important to disprove this. And Charcot's project, Charcot was really the founder of modern psychiatry, you could say the chief of La Salpêtrière, the famous insane asylum close to Paris. Charcot's project was to give an organic base for cases which until then were considered cases of possession. And you can see why. This is a case of what used to be called lethargy, we would say catalepsy. A lady lying with her neck on one chair and her feet on the other chair. Something which seems physiologically impossible. Supporting her entire weight, on 2 points. This is one of Charcot's famous subjects, Augustine. In a state of ecstasy, she was one of Charcot's foremost subjects. Then Charcot used a term for these patients, which is now discredited. He called them hysterical. And the understanding was quite biased, obviously. These cases, which are prevalent in women, I must say, far more prevalent in women than in men, were seen to be due to a disturbance of the womb. The womb is called the hysteres in Greek. Now, the term is no longer used, and we now know that these disorders exist in men as well as in women. But all Charcot's team elucidated a large number